a lot of people think I'm like, oh, Haz, you're just this naive tanky that likes everyone who waves red flags. No, I know what I'm talking about when I say this. I understand this position. I know the ins and outs of this position, right? Now, the reason it's wrong is because it has a mistaken conception of the significance of democracy. So, we have a recent reinvention of democracy that happens around the 70s and 80s, right? Well, actually, it happens during the Cold War specifically. So during the Cold War, the meaning of democracy was reinvented. Democracy no longer came to mean this kind of a state that is like infused with the popular character of the masses and the peasants. Because you have to understand the Social Democrats didn't have an institutional conception of democracy. They had a populist conception of democracy, where the state reflected the character of the broad majority of the peasant masses, specifically through things like land reform and things like that, right? So first, it's a mistaken conception of democracy. So there's a few things. The democratic revolutions he's talking about are not democratic revolutions in the strict Marxist sense. They are NGO color revolutions who have as their vanguard the rentier monopoly classes, right? Like these neo-feudal classes, pretty much, who gain all of their revenues from rent, from intellectual property, and from professional managerial occupations, salaried people, monopoly capitalists, and yes, oligarchs, people like Soros who are speculators. These are the only thing democratic about these revolutions is the absence of a singular popular will. And they call that democratic. So democratic has come to acquire this meaning of just multiplicity for multiplicity's own sake. Pure multiplicity. Pure diversity. Pure open society, as Soros would put it, right? That's what they mean by democracy. But this is actually not... It's not actually ruled by the people, like the actual people. It's not building a state that has a popular character. It's building a state that is devoid of any singular popular will to begin with, right? And this is a state that is able to be fully controlled and beholden to the interests of the globalist and neo-feudal ruling class. So we have a very paradoxical situation. The countries that resemble the ancient regime the most today, which have monarchs like Xi Jinping or Putin, who just have these strongman figures, those are actually the democracies today. So it's like, today, monarchy, right? Just in quotations, is democratic. Whereas democracy is tyrannical and oligarchic and despotic, right? So people need to keep that in mind. This is a wrong way of framing it, right? I mean, Ukraine has a democracy, which is what? It's the rule of the NGOs, and it's the rule of billionaires, and it's the rule of these institutions, right? But it doesn't actually have a state that has like any real popular character imbued in it, as manifested in some kind of singular will. Yeah, exactly. The French Revolution was not the rule of MSNBC, okay? The French Revolution was the rule of... It was a populist event. It was popular. It was rugged. It was the masses. The people with the capital P, right? It was authoritarian. People don't fucking understand this, right? So this thing about democracy, we are living in socialism. Hate to break it to you. Just skipping a lot of bullshit. We're living in some kind of socialism, right? So, I've explained this before, right? Our mode of production has changed. We don't live in classical bourgeois capitalism anymore. So today, the real successors of bourgeois democracy are states like Russia and China. Authoritarian states have actually succeeded bourgeois democracy. Because bourgeois democracy has evolved in such a way that it's no longer this like purely neutral, negative freedoms. It actually takes an active role in the economy. It's like, for example, FDR was considered this authoritarian tyrant, right? Why? Because FDR had to go beyond the limits of bourgeois democracy. Well, the same is true for people like Putin, right? Putin nationalized the Russian gas industry. Was that democratic? Yes. Nationalizing the Russian gas industry was democratic because it subordinated the most important sector of the economy to the interests of the majority of the people. So it's democratic. Demos meaning people, right? People have a really twisted view of democracy in the historical sense. I'm talking about what communists used to say when they said democracy. They didn't mean the neoliberal democracy of George Soros and the Open Society Foundation and the NGOs and CNN and MSNBC. That's a fake veneer of democracy. It's not democracy. It's the veneer of a democracy, right? It's the rule of pure negativity, pure negation, the absence of any singular will, the absence of any singular determinate will, just the reign of pure multiplicity. Can I ask you guys a question? Is pure diversity of will democracy? Can you have a pure multiplicity of political will and have that be democratic? No, because the people are actually not the sum total of individuals. So what we're dealing with is a conflicting view of society here. In the West, the people are just the sum total of individuals. So since every individual has a different opinion, then what democracy means is that one opinion is never given too much sway. But from an Eastern perspective, a society is not made up of the sum total of individuals. Individuals are part of a bigger collective, right? And if that's true, then democracy must necessarily imply a state that exercises the singular will of the people. And I actually don't want to muddy the waters too much and confuse you guys too much here about what this means, because believe it or not, our founding fathers had a collectivistic view of democracy too. They did believe in a singular will. They did believe in a strong man, executive, almost monarchical presidential leader, right? They did their best they could to empower the executive branch, right? I mean, the executive of the United States had more power than the British Crown. They didn't like Parliament and the parliamentary model. They wanted a strong leader that represented the singular will of the people, right? We had a revolution against... No, we didn't! Because your history has been fucking lied to you. Read the book, The Loyalist Revolution, The Royalist Revolution. The founding fathers initially wanted to restore the power of the British monarch because they hated Parliament. They thought Parliament was the problem. And to learn from that mistake, what they did was create a very powerful executive branch so that there would never be any kind of equivalent to Parliament that would have the power it happen. Yeah, parliamentary monarchy is not a real monarchy. It's an oligarchic usurpation of monarchy. Hey, Victor, you're a fucking pussy because you won't get in my fucking VC. You fucking pussy. You want to talk about who's a pussy? Get in my fucking VC. Yeah, the founding fathers wanted a one-party state. This is all a history that's been completely erased from us, right? By the way, I want you guys to understand something. It's very well and fine to be like a Marxist who's like, oh yeah, the Democratic Revolution. This is the current Communist Party of the USA's line. That's why I'm surprised Tehran hasn't steered it in the direction of anti-Russian imperialism. Yet. She plans on doing that. She definitely does plan on doing that. But we don't live in modernity. So modernity was just where you had these shocking, revolutions, and it's the modern world, and it's electricity, and we're overthrowing the old world, right? The 21st century is the era of the morning after. We know what that means? It means, okay, you can have your democratic revolution, but then what? Right? Well, Russia had its democratic revolution, and then what? Well, then you have to go back, you have to attend to the actual realities of your country having a specific character, your people having specific determinate needs. And that was Putin, right? It's now what? And that's why authoritarian states are more advanced than democratic states. Authoritarian states are not pre-democratic, they're post-democratic. I want you guys to just drill that in your head. Putin doesn't fear a democratic revolution. He's a post-democratic figure, right? This is after the era of democracy. And we're maturing now. It's a post-democratic era where you've preserved the essence of democracy, but you're no longer limited or bounded by its form, right? I mean, Putin is not a dictator, okay? He's not. And the truth is, and I'm willing to, again, bet my balls on this, Putin doesn't fear a Maidan or a democratic revolution. What he does fear is the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. And the only reason Putin was knocking on the Soviet leaders wasn't because he wants to restore the Russian Empire. It was because he's trying to suppress the popularity of the Communist Party, which is the largest opposition party in Russia, fully legal and integrated into the government. And that's who Putin's scared of right now, is the Communist Party. So if Putin is knocking on Lenin or the Soviet republics, it's because he's dealing with an internal factional conflict within the Popular Front democracy that is the Russian state with the Communist Party. So Russia is governed by a popular front. It's a democracy that's governed by a popular front. The Communist Party is also part of this popular front. It's the second largest power within that popular front. And Putin doesn't control them. He competes with them, right? And they're gaining more power than before. And he was trying to knock on them, right? So that's why. He's not really afraid of NATO. This would be true if it wasn't for the fact that every single political faction within Russia is united behind Putin. Like, if there was some huge democratic movement in Russia that was like, yeah, Putin, you're our enemy, you'd be right. But the truth is that this is uniting the whole country, right? Regardless of you're pro-Putin or anti-Putin. I need you guys to understand, we don't live in a democracy in America. We don't. We have a deep state that is not elected. Our mainstream media is not elected. Our corporations that rule us are not elected. We don't live in a fucking democracy, okay? There's no such thing as a democracy as this guy's putting it. I mean, America's democratic and Russia's not? Why? Because the people who actually rule our country are, as Putin said, men in dark suits who are completely unaccountable to the public. At least Putin is accountable to the public. At least Putin's accountable to the public. Our deep state is not. You don't even know who these fucking people are. And look at this. Democratic, successful countries bordering European Russia are a menace to him personally. Are you talking about the neo-Nazi, fascist, extremely racist, xenophobic states? I mean, let's look at a map of Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe map. I just want to show you the absurdity of what this fucking guy is saying. So let's look at a map of Eastern Europe. So here's Russia. So I presume the democratic states he's talking about are these ones. So these states have literal Nazi veterans of the Wehrmacht and Nazi collaborators parade on the street regularly. They're extremely racist and repressive against civilians. And Russia's beef with them has nothing to do with the fact that they're democratic. It has everything to do with the fact that they're rabidly anti-Russian racists, right? Who else could you be referring? Finland? Russia doesn't give a fuck about Finland, okay? They don't give a fuck about Finland. Okay, the only significance of Finland has always been neutral, right? They don't give a shit about Finland. If what you're saying is true, this would have held for Soviet times as well. I want you guys to understand the democratic Fabian socialist theory of modern geopolitics. Can you bear with me and shut the fuck up and listen right now? Listen. What democratic socialists say is that Russia and China and all these other states are capitalist hellholes like any other state, right? But they lack democracy, and that's bad because democracy is a necessary part of socialism. So what they're saying is America is closer to socialism because at least we have democracy. Except that's not how politics work in China or in Russia. In Russia, the interests of the workers are not being repressed by Putin. Putin actually, his government, his Popular Front government, gives them a greater platform. Because in a neoliberal economy, you don't even have the ability to intervene in the economy in ways that would benefit workers, right? In Belarus, who's defending all the unions in Belarus and all the workers' interest in Belarus? It's not the democratic NGO forces who are extremely elitist and hostile to the people. It's Lukashenko. Lukashenko, the dictator, right? He defends them. So you need to understand that democracy, this dog whistle word democracy, is not beneficial to workers. It's a way to repress workers. Democracy does not benefit workers. It represses them. This is brain rot. Then fucking debate me, dumbass. I'll give you direct examples. Whenever these people are going around talking about democracy, they're talking about privatizing they're not talking about turning the economy into a bunch of workers' co-ops. They're talking about privatizing the company, giving Western financial capitalists free reign to do whatever the fuck they want, and effectively establishing a neo-feudal economy. Now, when you have the rule of tyrannical private corporations and Silicon Valley big tech platforms, is that democratic? Did we elect Mark Zuckerberg? Did we elect Jeff Bezos? Yet these people have a tremendous amount of power over our fucking lives. So in a democratic society, it's not that you have more freedom, you're more controlled there's less popular accountability than ever before, right? You need to get rid of this fucking idea that this is a conflict between democracy and authoritarianism. America is just as authoritarian as China or Russia is. The only difference is that it's not accountable. We don't know the authorities who control us. We don't elect them. They don't answer to us. They don't give speeches to us. We don't see their faces. That's the only fucking difference. People have a really skewed view of this, and this is what the left specifically, they're peddling this really stupid view, right? It's also peddling this view of, look, the modern world throws us into this fundamental uncertainty about the legitimacy of anything, right? Is a government legitimate? Is our gender norms legitimate? Is our sexuality legitimate? Is the way we eat food legitimate? We call everything about our humanity into question because we're thrown into this radical doubt about who we are, right? And any attempt people make to actually take a firm position and says, this is what we are, right? That is called authoritarian, right? The reason Russia is called authoritarian isn't because it's tyrannical. It's because Russians are insisting on the fact that they know who they are. They don't have this modern positivism or empiricism where they're just like, we have no clue who we are, so we need to follow these formal institutional procedures to externally verify our identity and our being, right? But I want you guys to know something. So you know about the Open Society Foundation, right? So I'm going to just give you a brief education about this because it's actually important. So the Open Society Foundation is from George Soros. Now, where did he get the name Open Society? It's right here. It's inspired by Karl Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies. So Karl Popper was a philosopher of science, and he promoted this view called falsification and falsifiability, right? So Popper took empiricism and he took positivism to its absolute limit, right? And he became this fanatical positivist and empiricist, according to whom we cannot know anything about the world without externally verifying it by some kind of institutional consensus or some kind of like neutral, formal medium, right? So that's Popper's view. And according to Popper, Marxism was unscientific because it was unfalsifiable. It didn't give us the breathing room with which to enable the possibility for it to be possibly proven wrong. So we couldn't know if it's right or wrong, right? So for Popper, we can't know anything about the world unless we subject it to some kind of formal procedure that verifies it, right? And this is what Popper contributed to the history of modernity. So in the modern world, we have Descartes' doubt. I think, therefore I am. The only thing I can know about my being, the only thing I can have that proves I even exist is that I'm thinking right now, right? So from there, we get modern science and we get modernity as a whole and all that kind of stuff, right? So Popper specifically applies this politically, and he says, every state that pretends to know what it is and speak on behalf of the people and on behalf of some kind of identity is totalitarian and wrong, and that the only real true state is a liberal democracy that verifies its claims through electoral procedures and so on, these external methods, right? So the way someone like Heidegger would respond to Popper is by saying that even before we have the ability to be certain about the world, we have a definite character and a definite being. And our knowledge of that doesn't take the form of formal certainty, but a more fundamental type of knowledge, right? A more intuitive, phenomenal type of knowledge that is reflected in the form of our practices and reflected in the form of the way we actually reproduce ourselves, right? Does any of this actually matter? Of course it fucking matters. Why do people like Roderick Day hate Heidegger so much? Because Roderick Day is, in so many words, also a Karl Popper fan. Popper assumes that the only kind of knowledge we can have is the formal, certain knowledge, right? But there's some forms of knowledge that are unconscious. There's some forms of knowledge that you cannot be certain of, but which we nonetheless take for granted and somehow make meaningful and rely upon, right? So this is why we have such a skewed view of democracy today. So I'm going to, we have to bring out the Microsoft Paint, right? So this is what we're dealing with. So democracy, right? We have democracy. So on the one hand, we have democracy as the pure multiplicity of diversities and differences, and it's just all different. Difference. It's all diversity and difference. And that's the Soros view of democracy, right? Soros view is just multiplicity, right? Then you have Marxist view, historic view. You had the historic view of what democracy was, right? Which was more like that fist you have that's growing out of many, right? Many people. So you have, a multiplicity, right? Of people, and then they're all raising their fists, and he's raising his fist, and he's raising his fist, he's raising his fist, he's raising his fist, right? So that's the historical view of democracy, right? And this is the Soros view, which is pure conflict and pure multiplicity, right? So you have to understand the sources of this view, this idea that Russia is not democratic. Yeah, out of many, one. That's exactly it. Historical view of democracy is out of many, one. The George Soros view of democracy is many, 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 many. Many, 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 many. That's it, right? And that's their view of democracy. This is the reason why Putin is... I mean, I want you guys to think about this. What if Bernie Sanders became president? If Bernie became president, wouldn't he... and he actually did shit, wouldn't he be considered like an authoritarian dictator like Hugo Chavez? He would have to like... He would have to be this Caesarian strongman because Congress will try to fuck him over, right? Because when you have a singular will, you're going to be authoritarian. The only thing that prevents authoritarianism, as in the way that leftists describe it at least, is just by having difference for difference's own sake. I mean, Nancy Pelosi said that this country needs a strong Republican Party, right? I mean, it's straight out of the horse's mouth. This country needs a strong Republican Party. Caesar was not democratic. He was. That's the thing, is that Julius Caesar was democratic. He actually did represent the Roman people. And the patricians, who were talking about the sanctity of the republic, they were anti-democratic. They didn't want the people to have political representation. They wanted the pure forms and procedures to remain intact, which actually disenfranchised the majority of the Romans. I mean, Caesar, he extended rights to ethnic and religious minorities. Of course, he was more democratic, right? Fun fact, Russia does not exist. It is a fake puppet government named and recognized as a sex state by the USSR, the United States, including the idea that the US would recognize true socialism. Lol. Okay, what a stupid thing to say. It's just like a frankly stupid thing to say. Yeah, the only difference... Okay, it's, you either are going to have authoritarianism or oligarchy. Choose one. It wasn't named... What are you fucking talking about? It was also recognized by Saddam's Iraq. What does that mean? Saddam's Iraq had to recognize it too. But yeah, it is true, and this is something communists in Russia also acknowledge, the USSR was dissolved illegally. And that's true. The USSR was dissolved illegally. It was an illegal dissolution of the USSR. That doesn't change anything. I don't see what that's supposed to change. Your mom was dissolved illegally. Get in my VC and talk shit to my face if you want to get unbanned. Let's continue. The reason why Putin is doing his best to undermine the European Union... This is AstroTurfed. I cannot believe 13,000 people like this, right? He cynically supports the European and American far right, up to support from clandestine intelligence services. This is fucked. I used to believe this shit. I literally used to believe this shit. Back in 2014, I believed this. It's actually embarrassing looking at this. It's embarrassing for me because I'm like, I really need to combat this misinformation because I used to be there in 2014. I used to have this theory, right? Before Trump got elected. In 2014, I had this theory, right? Because yes, it did seem like Russia was aligning itself with the far right in Europe, right? But the thing is, it's not true. And upon deeper investigation, Russia aligned itself with all populist forces, regardless of where they lied on the political spectrum. So this is wrong. I might have to write a Substack about this. Oh man, you guys are missing the theory. I feel guilty because it's like I spent years debunking this, right? And it's like now I can see that like no one even knows that this theory that exists. I wrote a book about the theory of statehood, and that book like almost catalogs my shift in perspective, where I came to realize there is objectively an aspect of statehood that precedes any type of formal democratic legitimation.